Welcome back, everyone. Last time we were taking a look at Baroque art, which is art of the predominantly of the 17th century, which really has its origins in Italy with Caravaggio. And so last time we spent some time taking a look at the transition between mannerism, which comes out of the Counter-Reformation, and then towards the end of the 1500s, early 1600s, we see this development of the Baroque art, and this starts to move north, starting to influence artists up in the Netherlands, and the predominantly the merchant class takes a hold of these ideas, and they want their art to resemble this new style that's emerging out of Italy. And so we see that Baroque art becomes an international style, where mannerism is kind of a brief moment after the Counter-Reformation and mainly stays in Italy. Baroque art becomes an international movement. It's going to mainly deal with the Enlightenment and also Romanticism. And so first unit really covers Italy, and that's predominantly all it covered. We did cover a little bit of the Middle Ages just to show you that juxtaposition, but mainly it's dealt with the Renaissance. This second unit is mainly going to focus on the Enlightenment and also Romanticism. So they'll encompass two eras. I wanted to introduce the Enlightenment to you with a quote from Charles Dickens in his Tale of Two Cities, and he says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way." In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on it being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. And the idea of this, the Enlightenment, and Charles Dickens writes this about 100 years after the Enlightenment, and so he's kind of writing this in retrospectively with better kind of eyes. As you get distance from an era, you're able to kind of see what are the main ideas that emerge from it better than when you're living in it. And so as he kind of takes a look back at these times of the Enlightenment, he says that it was really a period of extremes. It was extreme happiness, it was extreme suffering. There's a lot of wisdom, but there's also a lot of foolishness. And so we're going to take a look at this, how this era of enlightenment, which means intellect, it means the era of reason, or the era of science, is going to produce a lot of human benefit. But also, on the other end of that, there's opposition in all things. It's also going to produce a lot of problems. And so I want to be able to show you both sides of that, as Charles Dickens nicely captures in this quote. There is that duality to this particular era. So I want to go over just a brief historical context, and we'll take a look at the intellectual shift, some of the major themes that coming out of the Enlightenment, and then we'll take a look at how these ideas influence art. And so we'll take a look at aesthetics, which again is the term that just refers to the idea of beauty and how beauty is represented within the arts. And so these are some student learning outcomes that I want you to be able to know. I want you to understand what the term Enlightenment means. I want you to understand the terms feudalism and absolutism, which we're going to go over today, and how these political systems influence society. I want you to be able to comprehend the social and historical events leading up to the Enlightenment, and know why France became the cultural center of Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, rather than Italy, right? So we're seeing a cultural transition to France. I want you to apply the Industrial Revolution and the American Revolution to the intellectual and cultural shifts of the Enlightenment, and then know the main aesthetic principles of the Enlightenment and apply these to the art and literature of the era. And so by the time we finish up all of our discussions on the Enlightenment, this will be a multi-lecture, kind of multi-series event. I want you to be able to know these 6 main ideas. So something to look for, something that can guide your notes. And again, what you should be doing is you should be printing out your study guides for the next exam and using them to guide your note taking as you go through these lectures. Let's take a look at the Italian wars. We talked a little bit about this before when we talked about mannerism and the influence of the Italian Renaissance moving north and starting to take its art, its cultural ideas, its vision to the north and influencing the Northern Renaissance. The Italian Wars were a series of wars between Italy and France that ended the stability that Italy enjoyed in the 15th century and shattered Italy's dominance over its cultural, economic, political dominance in Europe. It was started by Charles VIII and continued by Francis I of France. And so you have these constant invasions by France into Italy, which shatters the economic stability, it shatters the political stability and cultural stability. And so society starts to be broken up. And so what we have as a result of Francis I, and France is now coming on the horizon as the number one cultural and economic powerhouse of Europe. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about how, as France becomes this cultural and economic center, some of the major changes that happen in France that are then going to influence the world. And so where the Renaissance is kind of the center or centered in Italy, the Enlightenment is going to be centered in France. And so a lot of the political and intellectual changes are mainly going to center in France and then spread to the rest of the Western world. One thing that we'll take a look at with our Zoom meeting next week is we're going to take a look at this social pyramid, and think about ranking those who have the most power, influence, or wealth in our society today, and then placing those with the most power at the top and those with the least influence at the bottom. And so this is just a good way for us to think about the social structure and whether we have a social hierarchy today, and if we did, what would it look like if we were to recreate it? And I want you to think about these terms as we start moving towards the understanding the Enlightenment, to be able to understand what's happening, some of the dynamics within the Enlightenment as we think about that social hierarchy. The Enlightenment, this is my definition of what the Enlightenment is. It's a historical, meaning it has a set period in time. Social, meaning it influences society and how people interact with one another. Intellectual, meaning it has a set of ideas. And cultural movement, meaning it influences art and artistic manifestations that focus on the importance of human reason. It used scientific methods to encourage political and social reform, believing that if we can apply science to politics, we can improve the happiness of society, right? Montesquieu asserted that the best government had a separation of powers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau asserted that people give up their freedoms in a social contract to receive things like protection and roads. And Immanuel Kant argued that it is the government's responsibility to educate its citizens to create a better society. Ideas like these greatly influenced the American and French revolutions. This was a time of political changes. So I want to talk about some of those changes and what the political climate was like prior to this. And so this will help you to understand what they're pushing against and some of the main ideas that they're contending with, right? So the first term I want you to be able to understand is what is known as feudalism. And some of you may have studied this in a history class or other classes on campus. But mainly it's a political, economic, and military system reliant upon personal loyalty and kinship. And so again, political meaning that it's a way of governing people. Economic means it's a way to distribute goods and services. And military system meaning that it has its own system of protection. Mainly what feudalism is, it would be, if you go back to the fairy tales, right, you're going to have a king and a queen, and they're going to rule over the people. and then they're going to have some knights that's going to then protect the land, right? And this is going to be the major political system of the Middle Ages, and it really doesn't change much. It doesn't change during the Renaissance. You still have a lot of this throughout Europe during the Renaissance. You have a small pocket in Florence where you have the wealthy merchant class that rises to become powerful. But that was really an anomaly, and that really helps to spark the Renaissance. So what you have during the Enlightenment is similar ideas now taking effect, but the problem that you're going to face is that political leaders seldom give up their power voluntarily, right? And so you're going to have there has to be some major changes. What happens during a feudalist system is it's mainly based on an agrarian life, where you have the landlord who owns the land, and that's going to eventually become the king, and then he rents out a plot of land to people, and then in return, the peasants who are farming that land that the king has rented out has to give a portion of their crop back to the king at the end of the year, right? So it's really a system of land ownership and renting out land, and so really this is the main crux of what feudalism is. And I think we talked about this before, but in England, the queen owns all of the land. She still owns all of the land, and so if you buy a house or you're building a house in England, she still owns that land, and if you don't pay her, right, she can take not only the land, what she owns, but she can take your house, right? And so it's a kind of an interesting relationship. But I think to some extent we could argue we might have some of that in the United States, where if you don't pay the taxes on your property, right, the government could come in and take your land. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we talk about some of the political philosophies that are coming out of this era. And generally, the military system, what the king would do is he would hire a vassal, or sometimes it's known as a knight, to be able to protect his land from invading kingdoms. And then in return, the king would give a small portion of land to that vassal or that knight to be able to have his own land, to have his own peasants on. But taking a look at this kind of society, right? 90% of the population were peasants. Mainly they were farmers, and their life was a juxtaposition between extreme intense work from sunup to sundown to an extreme periods of boredom, right? During the winter months, there's not a lot for the peasants to be able to do. There's no land to really farm, and so they have extreme boredom during the winter months, which leads to a lot more alcoholism. And then during the spring and the summer months, they're constantly working. They're working nonstop, and so the farmers have this kind of extreme life cycle that they have to continually push for survival. Mainly, their life was extremely brutal, harsh, and if they were lucky, because it was so brutal and harsh, it was extremely short. The average lifespan was in the mid-20s, and so people didn't live very long during this time, partly due to the harsh brutality, but also due to disease and sickness. The clothes that they wore were very cheap and very rough. They either wore kind of a coarse wool or a linen. And the social engagement, they had no education and they had no political voice. And in fact, for the most part, it was illegal to teach a peasant how to read. And so the idea for this is they wanted to keep them ignorant so that they can control them better. Most of the time, peasants were bound to the land as serfs, meaning that they could not go to, if I had a kingdom of Rexburg, let's say, I would bind you to this particular land of Rexburg so that you couldn't go to Idaho Falls seeking a better gig, right? And so the idea is that they try to restrict people's mobility, restrict people's ability to find a better lot in life. The aristocracy, on the other hand, was made up 7% of the population. Mainly these were the landowners, and they lived a life of luxury. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, and so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there for later use. But mainly, the life of the aristocracy was a life of entertainment. They mainly comprised of going from one party to the next, and so they would travel around from one kingdom or one land to the next. And what would happen is the aristocracies of other kingdoms would invite other kings and queens and their royal family, their royal court, to come and stay with them so they can develop an alliance. And so mainly they went from one place to another, just constantly drinking and partying. It wasn't really a life of hardship or brutality. It was a life of entertainment. They played billiards and they played tennis, and they enjoyed wonderful food on the backs of the peasants. The aristocracy wore extremely elaborate silks, expensive silks. One king's robe was laced with gold and diamonds and was worth about $24 million in today's currency. And so a very different kind of life, right? Where the peasants are having this brutal, harsh life. They're having a life of entertainment. Very different kind of engagement, right? They're going to hunting parties, tennis parties. They're going to, interestingly, bathing parties, whatever that is, dances, balls, operas, concerts, plays. And so their life was mainly a life of luxury, and it was very different from the lives of the peasants. But they justified this as it's good for the aristocracy to be able to live this life, because me living this life is like you living this life, right? That was kind of their justice. So if I was the king of Rexburg, the idea that I would try to promote is that me living the good life is actually good for the entire kingdom of Rexburg, because that way everyone else, right, in Idaho Falls and Sugar City and Salem or wherever, sees how good my life is, and they think, wow, those people in Rexburg must be really good. That must be a really good kingdom. And so there was they used justification in order to justify the peasants and why they had their life so poorly. The other type of justification that they used was this idea of bloodlines, right? That you were that the royal blood was valued more than another person's bloodline. That there was an inherent inequality, that God gave the aristocracy the divine right to rule. Therefore, they must be better, they must be more righteous, or they must be more intelligent in order to rule. And so if you were born a peasant, you pretty much died a peasant. There was no class mobility during this time, and the justification was that's the way God wanted it, right? Who are you to question divine providence? But it's kind of interesting, the type of lifestyle this is. The monarchy was 10% of the population, and they owned 90% of the wealth. Thinking about, wealth distribution. The peasants were 90% of the population and owned 10% of the wealth. And so there's this great disparity that the Enlightenment is now going to pick up on and going to question. So this is some of you doing math might say, well, where's the other 3%? And the other 3% were the clergy. Those that went into the church were the other 3% of the population. This is the hierarchy that came out of the Middle Ages, right? Where you have the Pope and the church at the top, the monarchy at the kind of right beneath them, where they'd have to get their authority from the Pope and the church to be able to lead. Otherwise, they would have no justification of why they're living so high in the hog, as the saying goes. Then you'd have the members of the royal family, the nobles, down below the king, right? So all of his, brothers and, cousins and whatnot would be here. Then you'd have the knights and the vassals. The military class would be underneath them, protecting their wealth. That was their main job. And then below them, you'd have the merchants, some of the merchant class, some of the farmers, some of the craftsmen. And then below them, you'd have the peasants and the serfs. And so farmers would be people that would actually own some small portion of land due to inheritance or something along those lines. And they would kind of own their own kind of portion, but they generally didn't. They weren't a very big part of the population. And merchants and craftsmen, they were the ones that were supplying the farmers with tools and whatnot. But the main part of the population were peasants who were the farmers, or then the serfs who are kind of beneath them. Those are the ones that had even less restrictions, or even more restrictions, even less freedoms on them. Thinking about this, I always like to kind of compare this to what this means for us today. If we were to take a look at the distribution of wealth and the hierarchy today, what would we say? Is the distribution of wealth? And we actually did a study on this, a Harvard study. The ideal, quote unquote, ideal distribution of wealth, if you were to divide people into 5 groups, right? 20%, to 60, and then 80, then 100%. The ideal, right, is a complete distribution, equal distribution of wealth between 100% of the population, right? So this is the idea of socialism. But most people believe that doesn't work, or it won't work, or hasn't worked, however your mindset is. And so most people said, well, if we were to take up, these 5 groups, right, 20% to 40%, then 60% and 80% to 100%. If we were to divide up these with the poor, the middle class, and the rich and the very rich, what would it look like, right? How would you distribute the wealth? And this is what most people came up with, right? So the poor would have, a little bit, enough in order to survive and have a bit of wealth, and then there would be the very wealthy at the top. And so there would be, an economic disparity between the rich and the poor. But generally, right, there's not going to be a huge discrepancy where there's going to be this class mobility, right? So this is what people think the ideal economic system looks like. And then they asked them, well, what do you think it actually looks like, right? And so they said, well, of course, this is what I think it should look like. But actually, I think this is what it actually looks like. So the poor are actually there's going to be some poor that are below the poverty level, which they think is unfortunate, right? So this is people saying, well, I realize that there's some economic disparities. That's a problem. And this is what I think that the problem looks like, right? And so the poor have less money, right? So each of these is green blocks is a representation of wealth. And then there's going to be, 90% of the population, right? 90 to 100%. So the top 10% of the population is going to have a vast majority. So this is what they actually think it is, right? But the truth of the matter is this is actually what it is. This is the reality of the situation, right? Where the poor they don't have enough income to even register on the system, right? And then you have the very rich, the very wealthy, the top 1%, where their wealth can't even register because they have so much money. And so in some ways, as we think about our, economic disparities today, yes, capitalism has done wonderful things. It's gained a lot of wealth for people. But then the question is this really what the most people want, right? Because this is what most people want, right? This is what they think is the ideal. This is what they think it actually is. But the reality is far different, right? So as we think about, well, why in the world would anyone of the peasants, why wouldn't they rise up against this? Why wouldn't they say, hey, wait, why is it that you get to live that life of luxury? Well, part of it is because they use justifications. They said that God give me the right to rule over you, or I have better bloodlines, or get back to work. I don't care what you have to say, right? Then we have to think about what's going on in our world as we see, as we see the differences between what we expect and what is the reality. I want to take a look at the Limburg brothers. I've shown you this before, but this one is a good insight into the feudalist era, where you have the very wealthy shown on the far left here with the Lord, and then he's inviting people into his New Year's celebration. So here you have the clergy coming in to celebrate. And then you have the vassals, the knights back here, and then you have the castle in the background. The castle is always overshadowing it. But this is really the life of the wealthy, whereas if you take a look at the peasants, this is what the life of the peasants looks like, right? Very harsh, very brutal, constantly working in order to serve the greater wealth of the people behind them, right? And so we see this again. See with this is the difference, the different type of lifestyles between the poor and the very wealthy. So the other attempt that I want to take a look at is absolutism. Absolutism is a form of government in which all the power is invested in a single ruler or other authority. And so this is feudalism on steroids. And so what we see here is that the person in power, such as the king, is the legislative branch, meaning that he's the one that makes the rules. He's the judicial branch, meaning that he's the one that gets to rule on whether the rules that he makes are justified. And then he is also the executive branch, whose means that he's going to enforce the rules, enforce the law. And so all aspects of power is invested in one single person. I wanted to take a look at that because that's really what we have during the early part of the Enlightenment with Louis XIV of France. And so he's kind of the main ideal absolutist king. He controlled all economic issues. He was the one that set the tariffs. He's the one that controlled trade. He's the one that developed the laws. And so I want to take a look at his form of government because this is what the members of the Enlightenment are going to be reacting against, right? So in a lot of ways, Louis XIV, he comes into power and he is immediately kind of embraced. He's embraced as a person of change and reform. The writer Jean de La Fontaine embraced him, stating that he was the greatest of all kings. But once he was in office, he began limiting the power of others in the government and centralizing his own. Anyone that disagreed with him was severely treated, such as having their ears or their nose cut off. He felt that severely treating people was a kind and kingly gesture by a loving king who was enforcing God's will on this earth. He eliminated the standing army of peasant class, so he was going to now limit the power of the wealthy class. And so by creating a standing army of peasants, what that does is it takes away the need for the knights, right? So he's taking those that have had power in the past, and he's eliminating them to centralize his own power. He controlled the economy by raising and lowering tariffs on duties on imports to increase trade. He increased the import tax on raw metals to keep them at home to increase the army. And he lowered the taxes on exports of luxuries. And so he's trying to make sure that people are buying locally. But then he's also trying to, as he's increasing that market, he's trying to export it. And all of this is going to increase the amount of wealth and power that France has in Europe. He closed the random tolls of transporting commerce. In the past, a person may have to pay up to 16 tolls to transport goods from the north to the south of France. And so if any of you are in states that have toll roads, right, you kind of get the idea of the annoyance here. And he's trying to streamline that to increase trade from one side of the state to the other, or one side of the country to the other side of the country. And so he erased all of those 16 tolls and made it only one toll. And so it's simplifying the economic system. He increased the amount of trade and boosted industry in all of France. And he implemented a highway system to promote commerce, right? So the idea is he's trying to get the economy going. However, on the other side of this is the side of the strict kind of treatment towards the workers. He abolished the right to strike. If you have a problem with your employer, too bad. You cannot strike. It's illegal and you'll be locked up. Workers were treated with military discipline. Laziness and contempt were not tolerated because it impeded progress, right? People were to be competent and industrious. They were to work long hours, 12 or more, with only 30 minutes for meals, for a break, right? He even cut down the number of religious feasts and holidays to make more work days, cutting it down to 38. The workers now only had 90 days of rest in an entire year, right? So again, the whole idea is that he's trying to make sure that people are more and more industrious, which is great, growing the economic capacity of France, which then he's going to then turn to the arts, right? So he establishes the Royal Academy, where if you were lucky enough as an artist to be accepted into this, it was a regimented, very rigorous program. He would send you to Italy for 5 years And so he paid countless funds to acquiring and obtaining Italian art. And then if he couldn't obtain it, he wanted replicas, right? He wanted his artists to be able to replicate what the artists were doing during the Renaissance, right? The students that won admission to the King's Academy were sent to Italy, as I said, for 5 years, but they were required to to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and work till 10 o'clock at night. They were trained in copying and imitating the classical and Italian art, which became their models, right? And they were supposed to create a masterpiece every 3 months, which I don't know if any of you are in the art world. That's a lot of pressure, right? All of this was done to glorify the King of France, King Louis the 14th, also known as the Sun King. The effect of such an effort was a complete overhaul of French art, an influx of new palaces, churches, statues, and pictures. And so France becomes not only this economic powerhouse, they become a cultural powerhouse, which is a theme that we've been studying. We've studied that with the Medicis in the Renaissance, right? We saw that how they used their economic power to then turn it towards cultural influence. And we're seeing with Louis the 14th, he's taken his economic increase, his surplus, and then using that to pay towards the arts. And the idea for this is some people, I think today, in our society today, would say, well, that seems like a waste of money. But I think in their mindset is they're not really building things for today. They're building things for their legacy. They're building things for tomorrow, right? So that they can be remembered beyond their own culture. So they knew that there was something beyond themselves. It wasn't just about them in their world today, this idea of immediacy. They saw more long term. And so they felt that the art was a way for their legacy to live on long after them. As a result of these efforts, Louis XIV became the greatest patron of art that history has ever known. And so it's an important concept to see that transition from Italy to France. And I wanted to take a look at, just to kind of close today with the main focus of his art. This is the Palace of Versailles, and this is me walking up to the entrance. And so here you see the entrance kind of at the far, kind of at the center of it. There'll be some golden gates. I'll show you a couple other images to this, and then these here are just different wings to the palace. And mainly what the palace served as, it was originally built as a hunting lodge by his father. He spent a lot of his childhood there at this hunting lodge, and so he, having this kind of childhood nostalgia, decides to build it up and to make it the palace to end all palaces. And so all the palaces that come after this are modeled after Versailles, and none of them are going to match the glory that the Palace of Versailles has and the importance of the Palace of Versailles. But essentially it was a palace to get away from the busyness of Paris, right? So Paris is the economic center and political center of France, and Versailles is about 30 minutes outside of Paris. And so it was a way for the king to escape the busyness and pressure of the city. But as also a way to host parties, and so most of these became like a hotel to a extent, a hotel for the aristocracy, for people all over Europe to come and to enjoy. And so this is the Golden Gate that you would welcome to if you were one of the wealthy aristocracy. You would come up, and the gate would then open for you, and you were immediately welcomed by. And here at the very center is the Sun King, which is a symbol of Louis XIV, which saw himself as the sun shining his light on the world. And then you enter into the palace. And so today it's now just a museum. The whole thing is just kind of one giant place for people to go and see what it was like to have lived there. But this is the impressive size. I want to just give you a sense of this. And thinking about this, I want you to think about how this is leading up to the ideas of the American and French Revolution, right? The ideas of the Enlightenment, which is going to say, maybe there's a better way, maybe there's a better system. It is approximately 551,218 square feet for the actual palace, right? Give you a sense of that. My home in Rexburg is about 2,500 square feet, right? And so those of you that can do math know that I can fit 220 of my houses into this one palace, right? It could house 5,000 aristocrats from all over Europe. It generally had 14,000 servants watching over, right? Think about this as a hotel. Have all of them changing beds and making up and cooking. 2,000 windows, 700 rooms, 1,250 fireplaces, and it's on 1,800 acres. And I just want to give you a sense of what that looks like. This is a map of Versailles. And so just to give you a sense, this is the actual palace here, all 551,000 square feet of it, which is dwarfed in comparison to the grounds that go beyond it. And so this is the back end of the palace. And so you have all of these gardens for the aristocrats. The 5,000 aristocrats come and kind of their playground, right? And you kind of get lost in this. And my wife and I, a couple of years ago, we went, and I'll show you a couple of pictures. You can rent a boat, and we rented a hang on, where did that go? We rented a boat, and we're able to kind of paddle down here, and so that was kind of fun. And then we were able to. There's also now a bicycle rental, and so we rented some bikes, and we kind of explored the entire grounds here, and it took us, even on bikes, it took us several hours to be able to reach everything. We're mainly trying to head out this way. I'll show you what's over here. And then for those of you that are interested in kind of church history and stuff, it's right about here where they put the Versailles Temple, the Paris Temple. And so it's right on the outskirts of the Palace of Versailles. I just want to show you a couple more pictures. Again, just to show you the opulence of this impressive palace. Its historical significance, and also how Louis XIV is using all of these funds in order to glorify the palace, and in a way to glorify himself, kind of as a result. And so this is a view from the front. And so as you enter into the palace, this is what the palace looks like. And then on the back, right, you can kind of see where the gardens are, and the gardens just kind of go on forever. And then you have this kind of moat here in the background. And what the idea for this was is Louis XIV wanted to be able to have gondolas. He saw gondolas in Venice, and he wanted to be able to have a person paddle him around just like you would go in Venice in a canal. And so he built this specifically for that purpose, and so he can paddle around all day long. Now you don't have someone to paddle for you; you actually have to do it yourself, and you have to rent it. Anyway, so this is the back side of it. So this is the gardens are down here, and then this is where you'll come up. There'll be a train that drops you right here, and then you kind of walk up to it. This is the golden fence here, and right here is the servants' quarters where the servants would live, and then right beyond this is the horse stables where the king's horses would live. And as I passed through them, as I was walking through, these are nicer than most houses in the United States, where they kept the horses, right? Just to give you a context of that. And then this is the background. This is just me kind of going through and taking pictures of the gardens, just to give you a sense of how it's hard to get a sense of how large this is without actually going there, but I'm going to try to do my best to show you that. This is my wife on the boat as I was rowing. And this one took us, and I just went from one end to the other end, and that took us about an hour, maybe an hour and a half to get to an end. It's just impressive how large it was. This was a swan that was at the in the moat at Versailles, so I thought that was kind of cool to have that. Another kind of duck, another kind of waterfowl that were there. And then I want to take a look at this. This is the Hall of Mirrors. I just wanted to show you some insights into the actual palace. And so on one side of this, of the Hall of Mirrors, you have the windows and doors that open up, and then you have on the other side you have the mirrors, right? So they call it the Hall of Mirrors. Generally, this is a representation of Baroque architecture, which Baroque is supposed to be kind of boisterous and loud and busy and overwhelming, right? It's supposed to be opulent and over the top, mainly focusing on golds and crystals, and just to give you the sense of all of the power, wealth, and grandeur of the life of the aristocracy. And what he would do, generally, Louis the 14th would have people walk in here, right? They'd have to walk through the Hall of Mirrors. And then at the very end of the hall, he would be sitting on his throne. And so he would only really meet people once a day. And generally it was about right around sunset. And so he wanted to have people have the sun setting, right, shining through the windows on one side, and then the mirror reflecting that sunshine on the other side, walking all the entire length. And this is probably about the length of maybe half a football field. Maybe it's a little bit smaller than that, but not much. And you walk all the way through this and kind of blinded by the sun, and then you were to go and meet with him, and it almost felt as though you were entering into the presence of God, right? So the whole idea of this is you're going to, if you're going to meet with him, you're going to have a lot more humility, and you're going to ask for a lot less. And here are a couple other images. This is another shot of the Hall of Mirrors, just to give you a sense of its design, how it was created to demonstrate wealth and power and grandeur, and a couple other statues around there. The fountains that adorn the outside of the Palace of Versailles, which are designed to show the wealth and power of the king. And so the artists that he was employing for the Academy of Arts were just to mainly adorn his estate. Just kind of go through a couple more images of these. And these are just, these are one of the doors, and all of the doors that we have, generally there is a representation of the Sun King somewhere on them. And so you'll see that as a common motif as you go through. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what it would be like to go through. This is one of the many fireplaces, the 1,250 fireplaces that they have. Just to give you a sense that as I kind of stood next to this, my head kind of came up to here. And so these pieces of wood here are about almost the size of a tree, just huge. And this is just giving you a sense of what it actually looks like, right? With all of the gold and the laced, the gold plating and the crystal. Do a sense of what it was like to have lived there, right? The expensive china, while people are starving, right? The justification is that the king needs this, and this is just a bust of Marie Antoinette, which we'll take a look at as we go through. Oh, and this is me kind of getting ready to walk through. So as you go through today, you would think that it would be like this, and you kind of have your own individual experience, but it's more like this. You're just packed. This is one of the busiest places to go to tour in Europe, and my wife was taking a picture as I was walking through it. And you're generally your shoulder to shoulder. It's pretty crowded. Just give you a sense of size and space as I stand here inside the palace, inside the Hall of Mirrors. And then again, just the grounds. They still try to upkeep it as much as possible. When I went there, this was in April. One of the times I went there was in April. And that's where this picture is coming from. But they didn't have the fountains turned on. This one down here is what's called the L'Orangerie. What that is just the citrus orchard. And so in order to have the sense of how great the king was and how great his importance and influence was in the world, they would actually bring in orange trees or citrus trees to be able to adorn, so the king could come in and walk through the citrus orchard as though he's in a tropical climate. And so the idea of the Palace of Versailles is to bring the world to the king, so he can feel as though he doesn't have to go anywhere, right? Everything's just kind of brought to him. And so they still keep this to this day. And so those of you that have been to France or know much about France, it's not really a tropical climate, so they actually have to wheel these in. They keep them in in a warm indoors until it starts to warm up, and then they bring out the orange orchards, and they still try to keep that tradition to this day. I wanted to show you this one. This one is Trianon, and so this is something that Louis XVI, the grandson of Louis XIV, built. Just to kind of introduce this to you, he built this one in order to get away from the palace. The palace was becoming so busy and so many aristocrats that he needed a vacation spot, and so on the grounds in the gardens way off into the distance. This is where my wife and I rode our bikes when we were touring the gardens in the back. One of the places that we went was where he built his little vacation. So he had a vacation at his vacation home. And then this is the inside, just to give you a sense of what his vacation home actually looked like, with a fireplace and billiards. Give you a sense of the lifestyle of the rich and famous during the time. And then Marie Antoinette wanted her own vacation home, and we'll talk a little bit more about her when we talk about the French Revolution. But she was from Austria, and so she wanted a home away from home on the ground. So again, this is still on Versailles. This is still on the property. This is just kind of away from the palace. You kind of have to bike. It took us about, 10, 15 minutes on bike to get there from the palace. But she wanted it to look like her home. She wanted to have that kind of Bavarian, Austrian feel to it. And so she has this whole kind of farm that she built just for her, so she can get away from the life of the palace as well. And so, again, just to give you a sense of what it was like, what it's like to tour there, in case you're ever wanting to go. But what's interesting is I was going through the Trianon and the palace. This is the art that adorns the walls, and mainly it's about gods, as we see here. Gods, as we see here, kind of enjoying a life of luxury, surrounded by fountains, surrounded by gardens. And then the life of the aristocrats that are surrounded by gardens, that are surrounded by fountains. And so it's a way to suggest that the aristocracy are much like the gods, right? That they deserve this because they are God's instrument on this earth. And so you can see how the art is used in order to justify why they have so much and why people have so little. I just wanted to close here with a couple of videos that help to demonstrate Versailles.
Versailles is the palace other palaces were modeled after. The one many tried to outdo, but none succeeded. This ultimate royal palace is all about this man, the ultimate divine monarch, Louis XIV. He spent about half of France's entire annual GNP to turn his dad's hunting lodge into a palace suitable for Europe's King of Kings. The chateau started small, just the middle stretch of this grand facade. That was the hunting lodge where little Louis spent his happiest boyhood years. Once king, the massive expansion began. While today's crowds are tourists, 300 years ago this courtyard was a very different scene. The palace hosted nobles, thousands of nobles, each with an entourage. They'd buzz around from games to parties to amorous rendezvous in their sedan chair taxis. Imagine servants scurrying about, delivering secret messages and roast legs of lamb. And it's crowded to this day. Smart travelers avoid weekends, come late in the day, and use a museum pass to skip the ticket line. The Palace of Versailles was the residence of the king and the seat of France's government for 100 years. It's a long series of lavish rooms, each with its own theme and with every inch sumptuously decorated. In the late 1600s, Louis XIV, shown here with his capable hand literally on the rudder of state, was creating the first modern centralized government. And in order to personally control as much as possible, he gathered everything here. United under a strong king, with the continent's biggest population, a booming economy, and a powerful military, France under Louis was Europe's superpower. Around the year 1700, Versailles was the cultural heartbeat of Europe, and French culture was at its zenith. Throughout Europe, when you said the king, you were referring to the French king, Louis XIV. French was the lingua franca. France was in vogue. You name it. Clothes, hairstyles, music, theater, table manners, French taste spread across the continent. Louis was a true Renaissance man, a century after the Renaissance, an accomplished musician, dancer, horseman, statesman, art lover. He called himself the Sun King because he gave life and warmth to all he touched. He was symbolized by Apollo, the Greek god of the sun. Versailles was designed to be the personal temple of this god on earth, decorated with statues and symbols of Apollo, of the sun, and of Louis himself. The classical themes throughout the palace underlined the divine right of France's kings and queens to rule without limit. Here, Louis is shown with his entire royal family, all depicted as gods on earth, ordained to rule without question. Versailles celebrated man rather than God by elevating Louis XIV to almost godlike status. Louis was a hands-on king. He ruled for about 70 years and was the perfect embodiment of the absolute monarch. Louis summed it up best himself with his famous rhyme, "L'État, c'est moi." The state, that's me. Pleasure ruled at Versailles. The main suppers, balls, and receptions were held in this room. The ceiling is like a sunroof opening up to heaven, filled with action parallel to the action right here in Louis's court. The style is pure Baroque, which lends itself to propaganda art, a riot of exuberant figures. The Venus Room is a reminder that love ruled at Versailles. Here couples would cavort, blessed from above by the goddess of love. As if to encourage the fun, Venus sends down a canopy of garlands to ensnare mortals in delicious amour. Louis invited the nobility to Versailles to control or domesticate them. The domesticated aristocracy lived lives of almost enforced idleness. Games were part of Louis's political strategy. By distracting his nobles with billiards, gambling, and dancing, Louis was free to run the country. The good life was addictive, and under Louis, the blue bloods were hooked. This was Louis's ceremonial bedroom. His daily life was a series of symbolic rituals. For example, while he'd actually sleep elsewhere, right here, the Sun King would rise and set with the sun each day. Once mighty, now domesticated, dukes and barons actually competed to see who would hold the candle while Louis slipped into his royal jammies. Bedtime, wake-up, meals, it was all public ritual. The royal bedroom faced the rising sun. It was the center of the palace and the center of France. When you understand the themes of the palace's many rooms, a stroll through Versailles is a stroll through French history. The war room reminds us that Louis had Europe's leading army, and his reign came with lots of expensive wars. Louis ruled from 1643 to 1715. By the end, he was tired of fighting. Here in the Peace Room, peace is granted to Germany, Holland, and Spain as cupids play with discarded weapons and swords are pounded into violins. Louis bestows an olive branch on Europe as his queen cradles their baby twin daughters. At the end of his long reign, Louis, having exhausted France with his many wars, gave this advice to his great-grandson, the next Louis: be a peaceful king. The Hall of Mirrors was the highlight of the palace. No one had ever seen anything like it. Mirrors were a great luxury at the time, and this long hall was astounding. Imagine this place lit by the flames of thousands of candles, filled with elegant guests in fine silks, wigs, and fake moles as they danced to the orchestra. Under gilded candelabra and amid busts of Roman emperors, servants would glide by with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. And from the palace, guests would gaze awestruck at Louis's amazing gardens.
So it's a good way to kind of think about what's going on and to give you the immersive experience of, since I can't actually physically take you there, to at least give you a sense of what it would be like to tour it. But I like how he made the connection to the very famous Louis the 14th quote, "I am the state," right? Or the state, that's me. This idea that he was everything, right? He was all of France. And so by him living this luxurious life, that was what was good for the people. And so it gives you the sense that there's a sense of arrogance within that statement, I am the state. But there's also the sense of pride, right? That we as a community are in this together, and as I benefit, so do you. And this is exactly what the members of the Enlightenment are going to start to question. Are we really benefiting from the king's wealth and grandeur? I wanted to leave off. I always like to connect things to today, just to make it a little bit more relevant. I wanted to take a look at the American Versailles. This is a documentary that came out a couple years ago about a very wealthy family in the United States trying to create a Versailles-esque type palace in the U.S. And so they experienced some troubles in 2008 when the market collapsed. I think the builder of this, the wealthy individual who's paying for this, was in the timeshare industry. And so when when real estate plummeted, he had some difficulties. But they documented this idea of can we have this grandeur and wealth that they had in France during the 16th or the 17th and 18th centuries? Can we bring that to the United States? Would it work here?
It really was something walking through Versailles, and it was kind of emotional.
This is when she says Versailles, she's referring to the American version of Versailles.
Roller coaster. It's been so long since we broke ground. It's been almost like 15 years. I mean, we're building the largest home in America, and then we're not. Then it's up for sale, and then it's not for sale. But now construction is back on. Hopefully it'll be done in a few years, but I don't know for sure. Walking through Versailles today, I had plenty of changes to make. I mean, just looking around, I no longer need a jungle gym, for example. I realized we didn't have a hair salon, so I added a hair salon. Now, everyone keeps asking me, how many bedrooms, how many kitchens does Versailles have? And the thing is, we can never come up with an exact number because a lot of times we're adding or taking away. And it sounds kind of crazy when people say, well, how many bedrooms and how many kitchens do you have? And they say, I don't know. I mean, my husband can't answer that question. When my project manager can't answer that question. But it's approximately somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 bedrooms, somewhere in there, and probably 7 to 11 kitchens. Probably more towards the higher numbers. My husband spoiled me in our current home with building me an addition of a larger closet here. So my closet here is probably around the same size as the one at Versailles. And I'm kind of bursting out of the seams of this closet. So I'm trying to figure out some way to expand my closet in Versailles, even though the one at Versailles is still a few thousand feet. I mean, it's still really big, but I want bigger. Like today, I came home, all the kids are like all over the place. I would like a bigger house so that they're like not all on top of each other. I got to take them over there because now they're changing their minds of who gets which bedroom. So we have to go back and repick the bedrooms now. So now Versailles is actually still growing. It's going to be bigger. And this house, even though I thought it was at its limit in size, it keeps getting bigger. Maybe I should stop giving it so many vitamins.
So as we see this, I mean, it's kind of an interesting mindset. As what makes this entertaining is the excess, right? The extreme excess that this family has, as they're wanting more closets, or the fact that she doesn't have her own hair salon inside her home. Now she needs to add that. It provides kind of a sense of absurdity. But I think that helps to understand what's going on within Versailles and what the members of the Enlightenment are seeking to question. And that's what we're going to see next time. Is we're going to see the ideas that are just below the surface starting to simmer, starting to get ready to boil over. And so these ideas of opulence and grandeur that the Baroque era is kind of a symbol of, and we see that with the Palace of Versailles as a good indication of Baroque architecture, and the ideas of absolutism and having all power invested in a single ruler is going to start to boil over, and that's what the Enlightenment is mainly going to see.